Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, December 10th, 2009. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, mixing it up with yeast. Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, talks about an experiment combining yeast strains in homebrew. Also, we talk about our third BYO-BBR collaborative experiment, and I hope that you will take part. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And you can find our shows on our show page at facebook.com/basicbrewing. And fans of the show there will get updates when we will send out episodes like this one right here. And again, during the holiday season, thanks to everybody who's clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you this show, and we definitely appreciate your support. You guys are really using that thing, so thanks a lot. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And don't forget, our 2010 Brewers Logbooks are here, and a bunch of you are ordering them. We appreciate that. And you need to get one, too. If not for Christmas, for the first of the year, because you don't want to, brew your first batch of 2010 without writing it down there in the logbook. And you can do that while wearing our new Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirt, too. Okay, enough of that. I got a bunch of positive feedback after our chat last week with Derek Johnson on how to make the most out of Mr. Beer. Mr. Beer users and graduates sort of came out of the woodwork to say thanks and to give suggestions on how they brew the best with Mr. Beer. Let's read some of those, shall we? Let's start with Robert, who didn't tell us where he was from. Robert says, thanks for the show. I've been using Mr. Beer, their kits most of the time, but now I steep or do all grain. I like the smaller batches, and since I have Beersmith, there ain't nothing I can't do. I just do it at a smaller scale. A great product for those of us who like smaller batches and smaller space. Thanks, Robert. Andy from Johnson City, Tennessee writes, thanks for doing a Mr. Beer show. Their kits are a great introduction to this wonderful hobby. Like Derek, I began with the basic Mr. Beer kits and quickly advanced to partial mash and all grain batches. In fact, a recent BYO article was written by a former Mr. Beer user that cut his teeth over at MrBeerFans.com with the rest of us. And he's talking about Jeff Karpinski. And I believe we talked about his countertop mashing method. And he says one of the first pieces of advice we give Mr. Beer brewers is to increase the time suggested to 2 weeks fermenting, 2 weeks warm conditioning, and 2 weeks in the fridge. I believe the instructions suggest 1 week for each. And Andy says, I completely agree with your thoughts on Booster, and that's that sugar solution or sugar powder that comes with the thing. Andy says, I found that when hardened, it does make a pretty good doorstop. Anyway, thanks for giving Mr. Beer a little respect. Ron from Pennsylvania writes, I'm one of the moderators over at MrBeerFans.com, and yes, I started with Mr. Beer and am proud of it. I learned all about fermentation control, yeast, etc. via my experiences with Mr. Beer. The shape of one's fermenter doesn't matter. It's the quality of the beer that comes out, he says. Ron says, as I sit here having just purchased a dedicated brewing shed and planning out and building my first Herms system, I was pleasantly surprised to hear you interview D-Rock. I've had the pleasure of drinking a few of his beers, and he is a Class A brewer. Excellent. Paul from Kansas City writes, I got my start with Mr. Beer and haven't looked back since. On my second batch, I switched to all malt and steeping grains and quickly progressed into 5-gallon batches of partial mash, ciders, and all sorts of other awesome stuff that I didn't know I could make before I was given a Mr. Beer as a kit. I still use my 2-gallon fermenter once in a while to make experimental stuff that I don't want to have to make, don't want to have to make 5 gallons of. Paul says, my sister-in-law sent me a 4-pack of refills for Mr. Beer last year for Christmas. I brewed them all at once, making a malt bomb that I then put on some oak. A year of conditioning later, it's very tasty and rivals the quad I spent hours preparing. I will be enjoying this one over the holidays this year with friends. So, Ron, another Ron, the second Ron, from Sugar Land, Texas, wrote a long letter, and I'll summarize here. Ron says, I would agree with your discussion that the regular refills that come with a standard kit, those that have booster, do not generally make what we think of as craft beer. I almost always purchase the deluxe refills, which contain a can of hopped malt extract and a can of unhopped malt extract, or the premium refills, which contain 2 cans of hopped malt extract. The other addition, Ron says, that a lot of Mr. Beer users make is substituting or adding either dried malt extract or liquid malt extract into our recipes. We add the extract to have a little more control over our brews than what is available from the standard kits, just like a lot of brewers do with full-size kits. Good point. He also says a lot of Mr. Beer brewers also batch prime now instead of bottle priming like Mr. Beer suggests in their instructions. I use one of the Mr. Beer fermenters as a bottling bucket now since they're so inexpensive. You can get a spigot for the fermenter that will lock open and a bottling wand that makes batch priming very easy. I just siphon out of my main fermenter into the second fermenter, add my priming sugar, and bottle. I get better carbonation across the batch and actually think this is easier and faster than measuring and pouring sugar into each bottle. Good point. And the final reason I like using the Mr. Beer fermenters is the size of the batch. I brew 5-gallon batches, a couple of beers, a cream ale, and an American Bock that most of my friends enjoy. For myself, I like more robust bocks, stouts, and porters. The beer my wife likes to refer to as crunchy beer because of the color and flavor. I find that the smaller batch size of the Mr. Beer fermenter, around 2.4 gallons, is perfect for my personal pipeline, so I can have several varieties of crunchy beer to choose from, not just one huge batch. And the third Ron from Springfield, Missouri, wrote a nice note and said he'd moved up from a Mr. Beer kit after getting one from his wife for Christmas. And Ron says, thanks for doing this episode. I feel that it was a good place to start to let me know that I can do this and that I enjoy the results. At first, I didn't think I would move to 5 gallons, but having done it, certainly don't regret it. And one more, Fred from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania writes, I do use Mr. Beer from time to time for smaller batches. Just wanted to add, if bottling directly from Mr. Beer, I attach a piece of tubing to the spigot to reach the bottom of the bottle to avoid the extra splashing. So there you go. A bit of feedback and some tips from current Mr. Beer users and those who have moved on to more advanced techniques. So it's not where you start, but where you go, right? I appreciate that. That was a fun episode to do. All right, well, let's go on with our chat with Chris Colby on mixing yeast and our next collaborative experiment. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about mixing it up with yeast strains here in a minute. But before we get into that, I want to talk about our next in the series of collaborative experiments. And this is another suggestion that we have gleaned from our chat on your driveway. This is one of the possible solutions or suggestions that we had talked about then, submitted by Twitter users. And this is whether doing a partial boil with an extract recipe makes a difference or not, right?
Right. There's a number of different ways people make extract beers, and the most common is to boil. Certainly, the most common historically is to boil a concentrated wort at a lot of people do it at roughly half the volume that their batch size is going to be, 2.5 gallons of wort boiling, and then they dilute it up to 5. Recent changes in the way people brew have added twists on this, where you add maybe half or less of the malt extract initially during the boil, and then you add the rest at either knockout or during the last 15 minutes of the boil. And then, of course, the option to all those partial boil options is to do a full wort boil. And, the differences that people claim that should be shown are, differences in wort color. They claim that if you boil, a concentrated wort, that your wort's going to be darker. And another claim, one that this experiment is going to get at, claims that your hop utilization goes down.
Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of factors with the hop utilization, right? There's density and volume.
Mm-hmm. The one is the fact that the density is higher on a condensed boil, so the hop utilization goes down just as a factor of there's more stuff in the wort, so you're less likely to boil out the isoalpha acids. The second argument, which is sort of less appreciated, I think, in the homebrewing world, is that you're diluting the wort at the end. If you're trying to brew, say, a 70 IBU beer, and you're making 2.5 gallons of wort and diluting it to 5, to hit 70 IBUs, you would need the wort to be 140 IBUs at the time you dilute it. So there's concentration and dilution are two different elements that, in theory, should work against getting high levels of bitterness in a partial boil.
And one strategy that you mentioned that people have taken to trying to combat that is adding at least half of the extract in the last, say, 10 minutes of the boil, because you don't need to boil extract for a full 60 minutes. That's been done at the extract manufacturer. All you're doing is reconstituting a wort, an all-grain wort that's been made at the extract manufacturer. And really the only purpose in boiling the wort is to sanitize it, essentially, right?
Right. There's a number of different things to get accomplished in the boil, and given that malt extract has been boiled before, brewery grade malt extract, the things like precipitating out the proteins and the hot break and all that, that's all been done. All you really want to do is re-sanitize it. And, depending on where you get your extract from, if you're using, a lot of people use liquid as the late addition just because when you pour it in the kettle, it doesn't foam up a lot. But if you're getting your liquid extract out of a can, unless the can is like bulging or foaming, you've got a pretty good, guess that your extract is already going to be sanitary. So you really don't need to, do much to re-sanitize it. If you get it out of a big barrel, then yeah, I would probably give it, 10 minutes of boiling or whatever. But
that's a good point.
Yeah, the sanitation is really the only reason you heat, malt extract wort up. And
if you get your if you get your extract dry, especially if it's been repackaged by your local homebrew shop, it's not in a sealed environment like in a can, a small can of extract as well. So how are we going to structure this experiment, Chris?
Well, a few years ago, I did an experiment like this where I actually brewed 8 batches of beer. I brewed 2 extract beers with a full wort boil, 2 with the sort of standard method that, at the time, the concentrated boil, 2 with extract late, and 2 with some other method that I can't remember what I did. And anyway, this was in BYO a couple years ago. And what I found was, the color, there was marked differences in the color. And flavor and other things were a little bit equivocal, but the one thing I didn't do in that experiment was have a highly hopped beer so that you could tell differences in bitterness. And so our experiment is going to focus more on, we'll focus on all aspects of full boil versus partial boil, but the main new one we're going to look at is the bitterness. And so what our experimental design will be is, the full experimental design will be, the brewer will brew 3 beers, very heavily hopped beer, something like either a Pliny clone, or you and I are designing a beer that uses a little less plant material in there, so you don't lose so much wort just to soaking up of the hops. We'll use very high alpha for bitterness, and we'll put a reasonable amount of late hops, more than reasonable, but not so much that you lose a ton of volume that way. But we'll have an IPA recipe too. And basically, the full experiment, if you want to do it, would be to brew 3 batches of beer: one with a full wort boil, one with a condensed wort boil, and one with a partial boil with late extract. But we also realize that's a lot to ask of everybody, 3 batches of beer. So we're going to, also give you the option. You could brew any of the 2, and, because that would help us out. We can use that data, use those comparisons, and that's fine. And another thing we're suggesting, we know a lot of people, a lot of extract brewers don't do full wort boils because they can't. They don't have a stove that's powerful enough to, bring initially 6 gallons of wort to a boil and then boil it down to 5. And so what we're suggesting is, also because this is a recipe that has a lot of hops, maybe try 2.5 gallon batches. Then you should be able to boil 3 gallons down to 2.5.
Right.
And also, just making 2 small batches of beer, might make sense economically and, as well. So, so the basic experiment is there's 3 different ways to brew, throw a lot of hops in and see what happens.
And if you don't want to, if for some reason, if for some crazy reason you don't like American IPAs, and I've heard from some of our friends down south, way south, that they don't like the overly hopped American IPA style. We'll give you the flexibility if you want to do another of your favorite styles and treat it in at least 2 of these 3 ways. We'll let you play along too. But we thought it would be interesting to supply a recipe with this one to see, to kind of give you the choice of going along with us and seeing if you get the same results that we do as well.
Sure. There's a potential to learn something from any style of beer, really. Any light colored beer should, you should at least be able to see the color changes. But even on any colored beer, things like, you expect a more concentrated wort to develop, a little bit more sort of boiling products, that, including caramelization or more likely Maillard products. That's the sort of the dark stuff that develops in the boil. And, there's the interaction between that and the yeast. And so, even if you're brewing a porter or something, you might learn something about the flavor differences in a partial boil versus a full boil. And, that's information that, no one would have ever gotten scientifically in the homebrew community, and it would be a good thing.
Now, are there any details that we can give to kind of help people out? Like I was thinking, I'm going to do my full wort boil first, full volume boil first, so that I can, when I'm doing my partial boils, I can add water in the fermenter to bring it up to the same level as the original one, so that we're not dealing with different. Hopefully, well, I don't know. Who knows what'll happen? But at least we'll have the same volume as a variable, or as a constant in there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You definitely want to, and especially if people are trying half-size batches. They might not be, have a real good idea what their evaporation rate is going to be. So yeah, if you brew the full wort boil one first, mark that on your fermenter, and then when you brew one or more of the partial boils, bring it up exactly to that level so that volume is controlled. Another just like helpful hint I would say is when you decide on the recipe, whether it's a Pliny clone or the recipe that James and I give, get all your ingredients at one time so that you don't go to the homebrew store the next weekend. Say if you brew one batch one weekend and one the next, and suddenly they're out of the hops that you used the week before.
Yeah. Or it might be from a different batch.
Sure.
It might be the same labeled, but it might be from a different, batch or bale or bucket or whatever.
Even a new year, they could
Yeah.
maybe they run out of their 2009 hops or 2008 hops, and suddenly the new stuff is there. Yeah, and anything you can do to make the brewing of the two different batches exactly the same is going to help. We're going to assume that these will be brewed due to time constraints, on different days, and probably just a lot of people are just going to either brew it one weekend and the next weekend, or if you have multiple fermenters, one day and then the next day. But just try to keep, as you do the first batch, take good notes on what you do and try to keep everything the same, as much as possible for the second batch.
Yeah, even using the same burner on the stove and trying to keep the flame levels the same. But one good thing about doing a smaller than 5-gallon batch, say if you do like a 2.5-gallon batch, you can use, say, 5-gallon carboys as your primary fermenter, as opposed to having to have, say, a bigger 6.5-gallon carboy or whatever. That say I've got more of the smaller carboys than I do of the bigger ones, so that's an advantage there.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you can, depending on what your setup is, you can brew full 5-gallon or smaller batches or whatever. Yeah.
So good. I think that, and we will get, hopefully by the time you hear this, you can go to basicbrewingradio.com or Chris's blog on byo.com and see all the details of the experiment. And what are we thinking as far as the deadline?
I think we said with the holidays coming up, for some people this is going to be an opportunity to brew, and for other people it's going to be an impediment. So I think we said February 1st. Mm-hmm. That would give people, you could either brew it over the holidays, and let them condition, or you could, in the first, week or two in January, you should be able to brew and get something conditioned by, the end of February.
Yeah. Or the end of, the end of January.
End of January, yeah.
Yeah. So then that'll give, I think we figured like eight weeks from now about. So.
Right. So that's quite a bit of time.
Yeah. It's longer than we've had before, I think. And also, if you have any suggestions on how we can structure the experiment, let us know. And if we do have changes, I'll let you know on the podcast. But anyway, we'll reflect that on the on Chris's blog and our website. Or actually, I'll probably just link to your blog for all the particulars. It'll make it easier.
Yeah, I'll have the experimental protocol written up. I'll have a link to a Pliny clone. Those are abundant. We'll also post the recipe and any hints or tips that we have going forward.
Excellent.
One thing I think we should mention, an interesting thing about this experiment is we do plan to send James and I's beer out to an actual lab for testing.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have the usual blind taste test that we do, but we'll also have an actual lab measure the IBUs, so that'll give us, it won't just be a case of, relative saying, oh, this one tastes a little bit more bitter than this. We'll have actual numbers on the IBU front for this experiment, which should be pretty nice.
Yeah. It's always good to have objective machine-taken data, since our tongues are so variable, so to speak. Well, good. Anything else on the experiment before we go on?
No, I think that's it. I just hope extract brewers will consider, brewing 2 or 3 batches for science, and a lot of, I think that there's a lot potentially we can learn from this experiment.
Agreed. Well, let's talk about an article by Les Howarth in the December issue of Brew Your Own magazine. It's about an experiment that he did with mixed yeast strains, and I thought that we could talk about what he did, but also use that as kind of a stepping-off point to talk about some other things, some other experiments that we could personally go into, and some kind of strategies of how we want to do them. So first of all, let's talk about what did Les do? What was his motivation for doing an experiment with mixed yeast strains?
Well, Les makes, according to his article, makes a lot of beers with the Fermentus SO4, that English ale strain that a lot of people use. And he generally likes most of the characteristics of it, but there's he detects a note that he describes as bready, and it sometimes takes a little while for that note in the flavor that he doesn't really particularly care for to age out of his beers. And so he wondered if he could take SO4 that had many characteristics that he really liked, combine it with some other strain, and just, get his particular, idea was to get the other strain to sort of metabolize that bready flavor away. But, the more basic idea was, can you mix two yeast strains and get, can you find qualities that you like in one, qualities you like in another, blend them together and get them both to work.
Now, what he did was he took dry. These were all dry yeast strains, and he rehydrated them together. And one thing that you could do differently, he says, from what he did, was you could hydrate them in different containers. But he just used the same container of water to hydrate these strains.
Right. That's one thing. Whenever you're doing experiments, it just always happens that after doing it once, you realize, oh, there's something else that I could have done better, I should have done, or whatever. And that's just part of science. And he had been mixing them both together and rehydrating them, and it occurred to him later that if you pour in one and then pour in the other, the one on the bottom might be getting a little more hydrated than the one floating on top. Mm-hmm. So that would be, if you were to repeat this whole experiment, that would be a good thing to do.
So he did collect some data, and there's a chart in the article. What he was looking for was the breadiness, the clarity, and kind of a score, as whether he liked the beer or not. And for instance, he said he mixed the SO4 with Danstar Windsor, and there was no bready nose. It was cloudy though, and he doesn't say whether he liked it or not. But then he looked at say, for instance, the Danstar Nottingham had some of that bready nose. It was very clear, and he liked it a lot. So I don't want to go through all of the examples, but he did see that in combining these two yeast strains, the one constant and then these other yeast strains that he used, there was a difference in performance in the flavor, the clarity, and the perceived likability of these combinations.
Yeah, it's interesting because he paired SO4 with a lot of these, a lot of different dried yeast strains. And, the interesting thing that he noted was that you would get a blend of characteristics from the two yeasts. I mean, there's a couple possibilities when you use two yeast strains of what would happen. It's entirely possible, like, before doing the experiment, one possible outcome that you would have to, think is possible is that, one yeast strain would just dominate the fermentation, mm-hmm. and you would not detect any hint that the other one was there. The one you're hoping for is that the good characteristics of both come together. But, another possibility is that the worst aspects of both yeast strains, would show up in the beer, and you would have a batch that just collected all the bad things that you like about two different yeast strains.
Now, what's going on in this? The yeast reproduces asexually, right? So there's not a crossbreeding going on in there, right?
No, there shouldn't be any crossbreeding. What would happen is that the two strains are growing, and if they happen to grow, if you happen to have the same pitch rate and they grow at the same rate, then they would both come to be 50% of the fermentation. Of course, that's not guaranteed either one of those to be the case. If you pitch more than one, or if one has a little bit faster growth rate, that especially if it has a faster growth rate, it's going to come to dominate the fermentation. And as to what's going on in the ferments with more than one yeast strain, it's really hard to tell. That would take a lot of like real high level science to figure out. But I mean, some reasonable suggestions are, sometimes a fermentation byproduct of one yeast might be taken up by another or absorbed or something. A good example is, let's say you had a yeast that you generally liked but was a big diacetyl producer. If you pitched that yeast along with another yeast that was a good diacetyl absorber, you might expect, before you did the experiment, that, you'd get the same characters from that other yeast, but, the diacetyl absorber might, absorb the diacetyl quite a bit. So, but knowing, you'd have to actually do that experiment to see if it worked out the way you thought. And also, in a lot of cases, whatever changes there were in the dual strain fermentation, you wouldn't really know what's going on at a molecular basis.
And to clarify, for new brewers, diacetyl gives you a kind of a buttery or a buttered popcorn or a butterscotch flavor. Yeah,
it's common in ale fermentations. All yeasts kick out quite a bit of diacetyl at the beginning of the fermentation, and then towards the end they start retaking it up, and any of this that's left over ends up as it can taste anywhere from like butterscotch and buttered popcorn are the when it's way out of control. In lower levels, some people say it even tastes just like a little bit of crystal or caramel malt in your. But yeah, it's generally avoided in most beers.
Now, some people, or there may be a bunch of brewers out there who have fermented beers with 2 yeast strains, but it was trying to kind of restart a stuck fermentation or a fermentation that they think or they thought didn't go as far as it should. So, for instance, if they were to start a fermentation with a 1 yeast strain, and then at the end of that, if they got a final gravity that was too high, they could throw in some, say, champagne yeast to try to dry out the beer a little bit more. So there's another strategy. Rather than just adding 2 yeast strains at once at the beginning of fermentation, you could have one do the majority of the work and then throw another one in there, say at the end or the middle even, to kind of play with some of the characteristics of the beer.
Yeah, with adding something late, you'd have to be whatever that second yeast is going to do it would have to be a really strong performer in that, because the fermentation would already be taken over by the first yeast, and whatever the second yeast was bringing to the table would really have to be noticeable. Like one thing like you mentioned, it was attenuation. If you had a yeast strain that you liked but didn't attenuate very well, you might ferment a beer with that strain and then add a more neutral but more highly attenuative yeast at the end. Although, if I were to do that, I'd probably just mix them both at the beginning, because might as well let the one strain get a little bit of a foothold in there.
Now, I've heard a presentation, and I've played with the technique myself a little bit. I think it was in Cincinnati that Greg from Yeast gave a presentation on mixing traditional yeast strains with Brettanomyces. Mm-hmm. And part of the presentation, and I think I interviewed him on the show, but part of their experimentation was adding them both at the same time, or adding, one and then the other. And I made an Orval-ish clone once that I got the recipe from Zymergy, where I added the dregs of an Orval in the bottling bucket. So, to get a little funkiness in the bottle, I added some of that wild yeast. So, stepping into the world of wild yeasts or Brettanomyces and such as that, that's another area where you, in blending both traditional yeasts and those, you can have some fun as well.
Yeah, and using wild yeast kind of highlights what I said earlier about you need the secondary yeast to really show its characteristics strongly. And the thing about wild yeast is that they, even a small amount of them produces noticeable effects in your beer. They'll be able to chew on the last little bit of sugars left in there that the regular yeast can't get to, and then the flavor and aroma molecules they produce are very potent, which is why you can just add a little bit in bottling and have that come through. Yeah, I've actually tried with mixed yeast strains in a couple different ways. One thing I tried at one point, I was brewing a lot of German style wheat beers, Hefeweizens. And at the time, I liked them, but I thought the overall banana Colby thing was like just a little bit strong. And I had the idea of mixing that with, Yeast 1056 and trying to, have it still have that flavor, but just a little less, which is what, now I wouldn't do that because I've grown to like those flavors a lot better. But at the time, I was just like, just trying to tone it down. And the interesting thing I found there with when you mixed, or in this case, when you mixed a flavorful yeast with a sort of neutral one, the flavorful one just completely covered up the neutral yeast. I couldn't really, I didn't do it scientifically. I didn't brew a batch side by side and test. But it seemed to me that it really didn't do much. But that experiment led me later to do some things when I got lazy and I wanted to brew a batch of beer and I had, sort of a strongly flavored, liquid yeast strain. And, I just knew that in the couple days leading up to when I had my brew day, I wasn't going to have time to make a yeast starter. I would pitch that yeast, the liquid yeast, and then just add dried, US 56, now US 05, dried neutral strain of yeast just to bring the pitch rate up. Huh. Because some other people I've met have tried that too, and they generally report that the clean strain really doesn't do anything to clean up the other strain. It just sort of gets it just sort of sits in there and ferments, and the more flavorful yeast strain does its thing. Which I guess the interpretation of what's going on there is that the flavorful yeast strain is going to produce all its it's flavor active and aroma active things, and the neutral yeast just isn't absorbing any of them. So they're there at and even if they're at that a little less than they would be in general, you just might not notice that difference.
That's interesting. So if you had like a vial of White Labs Trappist ale yeast or something like that, and you didn't think or didn't have time to make a starter, you could pitch that and, say, a packet of the US 05 and feel a lot better about it.
Yeah, or if you're brewing, like a really strong beer and you don't have time to make a starter, pick the flavorful yeast that you're going to use for the fermentation, and then pitch, one or two little sachets of dried yeast, something, US 05 is an obvious one there because that's dry and neutral, but neutral, but Nottingham would work pretty much just as well with good aeration.
Are there any don'ts? Like I know that when I did the thing with pitching the Orval dregs, it was a fairly low gravity beer, and I didn't put as much priming sugar as I usually did, knowing or thinking that the Brettanomyces was going to eat more of the unfermentable quote-unquote sugars in there, and I didn't want to have bottle bombs. So are there any other things that we might want to look out for not doing?
Yeah, well, when you get into the sours, that's a whole sort of another set of things. And generally any of those the wild yeast strains are going to be very attenuative. They're going to be able to break down carbohydrates that brewer's yeast isn't, and so over time you can get high levels of carbonation with those. Among quote unquote regular strains, ale strains or lagers, I think it would just be if you were planning to try to brew a beer and mix the characteristics of two yeast strains, especially if you wanted to do it on a regular basis, you would need at least a couple test brews to figure out if this was really going to work. Because there's, he's Les in his article, he did 6 different trials of different blends. But when you think about the amount of yeast strains out there, to mix all of them and try them. And really you need to do it a couple times to ensure that you could repeatably do it. There's a lot of different potentials, and it'd be something that if you were interested in, hopefully a productive way of going about it would be, pick the two strains, have some good reasons why you think the two strains would work together, and then, brew a couple batches and really, really take good notes on, things like your pitching rates, fermentation times, and especially, take a really good look at your tasting notes. And, if you really wanted to do it upright, the other thing to do would be, do a split batch wort experiment where, brew your beer, break it into 3 different fermenters, pitch yeast number 1 into the first one, yeast number 2 into the second one, and then a mixture of those, into the third. And, of course, balance your pitching rate so that you're, have the same pitching rate in each.
And one important variable that you want to keep track of is fermentation temperature, too. Because
sure.
It seems like if you have different fermentation temperatures, one yeast might do one thing and the other might do another. You never know. Yeah,
and there's just, in when you're talking about using different yeast strains, there's a million different things you could do. Like, in Les's experiment, he used, at least roughly equal pitching rates where, just one sachet of this yeast and another, but there's no reason that you couldn't, if there was a strain that you had some characteristic that you liked and you wanted to bring it into a fermentation that you normally do with another strain, you might pitch, 4 times as much as the regular strain and just a little bit of the secondary strain.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, there's timing differences too. You might pitch one first and let it, do its thing and then pitch another. Like, I remember a few years ago, I brewed a Santa Claus clone, and I did that. I had a wort I started out with like an Oktoberfest strain because I liked the strain a lot, but I knew it was not going to get up to the alcohol level I wanted. So I, let it start out that way, let it get down to, I forget, it was still like that 1050 or something when the Oktoberfest crapped out. And then I added the Zurich lager strain, like a big, amount of yeast from a big yeast starter, in it at that time. So yeah, with all the different strains out there, with variations in pitching rate, with variations in when you add yeast, there's a million avenues that homebrewers can pursue here.
Well, cool.
There's also the idea that in the old days, fermentations were almost always from a mixed strain, just because they didn't have control over sanitation, and brewers have moved steadily over time. Once it was possible to move to single strain fermentations, they went to that. So it's always good to at least keep in mind that maybe a single strain is the best thing to do. But certainly there's a lot of interesting possibilities in mixing yeast strains, and I think in this article he showed one example where he got in some cases a trait that he found undesirable in his otherwise favorite strain to go away when he blended it with some others.
Yeah. Yet more stuff we can play with as home brewers.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's the fun part. There's always, something you can do to tweak your beers to make them stand out a little bit from everyone else's. And, if you have a beer that you've brewed a lot and you like, but there's just a little something lacking, maybe think about a secondary yeast strain you can add along with your normal one to tweak it a bit.
Well, awesome. Excellent, Chris. It's been fun again, and we look forward to the experiment.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Well, thanks again to Chris Colby. You can get a free issue of Brew Your Own magazine by clicking on the BYO banner on basicbrewing.com, and if you decide to subscribe after reading, you'll be helping to support this podcast. We appreciate everybody who's done that. Also, please check our site and Chris's blog for the details of the experiment. At this moment, we're still working on that, but I hope that they'll both be up very soon. and I hope that you will participate. I hope that this is one that a bunch of people will participate in, and we can gather some useful data to tell people how to brew extract beers in the future. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our 2010 Brewers Logbooks are now here and going out. You need to get one before the first batch of 2010. We've also got our new Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirts on our shop as well, and they're going out too. Check out our homebrewing DVDs on our site, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits as well as our combo deals there on the site to save you a couple of bucks. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. We greatly appreciate your support, especially during this holiday season. And man, there were a bunch of things to choose from this week for the featured products. Lots of cameras as well, and lots of Kindles, Amazon Kindles. And those are exciting because I think we get a hefty commission on those. Anyway, our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Learning Mates Monkey Math and Math, Science, and Unix Underpants, a themed Foxtrot collection. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping, and we appreciate your support. And you can also, along with getting a free issue of BYO, you can join the American Homebrewers Association through our associate link. That's all, I guess. Until next week. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.